First of all, it's good to be back here. Father Michael, Father Peter, let me quote a few lines of Shakespeare. "Oh, never say that I was false of heart, though absence seemed my flame to modify. As easy might I myself depart, as from my soul, which in thy breast doth lie." I want to introduce myself, despite Kevin Starr's memorable comment that I was the best bureaucrat in Washington, a little differently. I'm enormously interested and impressed by the conversations that I hear at the Dominican school, but I'm a very different sort of beast. I'm a pew-level Catholic. And I don't mean the Pew Memorial Trust. I mean the pews of St. Eugene's in Santa Rosa and Holy Family in South Pasadena. I'm a lifelong, faithful, terribly Orthodox Catholic. But I'm not one who, beyond 12th grade, was trained in theology and philosophy. I am a poet, which means that I am an outsider in every crowd, even among writers. And to make matters worse, I am a Catholic, non-university poet, which means I am in a class of one. I spent the first third of my professional career in business, writing at night and weekends. Then I became a full-time writer, and then I was sort of drafted into public service, which I've still recently extended as Poet Laureate of California. I'm trying to put all of these worldly things behind me. And in these twilight years of my career, rededicate myself to the two things that really matter to me most, which is my life as a poet and my life as a Catholic. Now, I think of my primary intellectual mission at the moment is to help create, or maybe more accurately, recreate a space in public culture for conversations to happen that would not happen otherwise. My conversations, here I'm talking largely creative, critical, and educational, those conversations that we call literature. Literature is a conversation that has gone on as far back as we can go in humanity, further back even than the alphabet. It's a conversation between artist and audience, between the living and the dead, between the writer and those unborn. A mission that's not in some ways unlike the mission of the church and the notion of the communion of saints. There is a communion of poets, a communion of writers. Now, philosophy and theology, which are the dedications of this school, are ways of describing and communicating reality that are powerful and clarifying. But they're very different from the conversation that a poet or a fiction writer has. Like it or not, and I say this with sadness to an audience of philosophers and theologians, almost all of humanity, almost all of the time, experiences and explains their lives and reality in language that has nothing to do with conceptual, analytical knowledge. It is experiential, it is intuitive, and it is creative. Like it or not, the poet is the unacknowledged legislature of mankind. I thought when I first read Shelley saying that it was an imbecilic thing to say, but it is actually deeply true. That is why probably everybody in this room is deeply saddened, vexed, indeed possibly even angry, at the representations of reality that we get from Hollywood, that we get from Netflix, that we get from popular music, et cetera, et cetera. It does not, in a sense, allow our lives, our experience, our values into that conversation. This is the conversation of the arts, the creative conversations, is something that no matter how powerfully we develop our ability as philosophers and theologians. And I will have to say that in American intellectual life, philosophy and theology are the only two places where the Catholics can still field an A-level team. Not in other areas. Now, Ron, if I can ask you to verify me in this, you are probably the highest ranking clergy member in American literature because you're a deacon. That's how deeply the clergy go into American literature nowadays. The other conversations have had very real and very necessary conversations about what's the relationship between the laity and the clergy. There is no relationship with the clergy as an American writer. It is the presence of the clergy is virtually nil. Now there are some extremely well-read, erudite priests and brothers and sisters, but they do not have an active public position in the way that someone like Thomas Merton had only maybe a generation and a half ago. It has vanished. And there are probably, and once again, Ron, I'm going to ask for your concurrence on this, probably not more than a dozen. In fact, I don't even think close to a dozen faithful public Catholics who are well-known American writers. It is a tiny group. But let's say if we could field a dozen, that's a number that's worked for the church before. And so I don't, and one of those proved out to be kind of a loser. So I'm optimistic. I'm full of hope. I have no doubt that the church will prevail, though God knows how many, generations of torment we undergo. So my issues are really quite personal and practical. What can I and people that I work with do to take this conversation, which is literature, which is so powerful and influential, into the formation of individuals, and bring the Catholic voice meaningfully and resonantly into this? Now, I have really three very simple principles, which is the power of the word, the power of example, and the power of community. Now, when I mean the power of the word, I'm not talking about the gospel, although obviously that is the most enduringly, transformatively powerful word that exists. I'm talking about, in a sense, as a writer, how does one write so well that it cuts through all of the clutter of the media? One great novel can speak to millions across centuries. And what that means in a way is that the Catholic writer has to be terribly unchristian. And you cannot love all equally, or at least you cannot love the writing of all equally. You have to, in a sense, have an absolutely great, to quote the term of a famous Catholic writer, although almost nobody knows that he was Catholic, Ernest Hemingway. You've got to have a good shit detector. And you've got to basically identify not simply the good writing from the bad, but from the best from the good. And I'll give you an example of this in terms of taking these three principles into some specific cases. And what do I mean? 4 years ago, I decided, and unfortunately this story begins in the first person singular, that there needed to be a conference for writers, Catholic writers in the United States, and no one was likely to organize something at a broad national level at the scale that we needed to do it. So I decided to do it myself at USC with no sponsorship and no funding. But I believe in basically divine providence. I went and I talked to Father James Heft, who runs the Institute for Advanced Catholics, which has no institutional interest whatsoever in literature. But Father Heft agreed to do it if we could, I could raise the money. We raised the money, and we had 400 writers gather at USC, writers and students of writing. Now, in order to decide who was speaking, I was absolutely ruthless. No mediocrity, however much we loved him or however good a Catholic he was to be given a podium. It was only, the very best writers. And we created, and when I called people up, like Ron, he asked, what could I pay him? And I said, nothing. And I might be able to pay, we'll fly you there and things like this. And we brought people in, and we had a tremendous experience. And people said, now we should do it again. And I said, I won't, but you will. And so to take, in a sense, to create the community and then to refuse to lead it, to ask the community to, in a sense, perpetuate itself. 2 years later, it was done on an even a larger scale at Fordham, and this fall it will be done on an even larger scale at Loyola of Chicago. Villanova has already asked for it for the next one, and I'm assuming that Notre Dame is probably somewhere in the line for one of these conferences. Out of that conference, what happened is very easy to describe. 400 people, most of whom felt isolated and hopelessly besieged in their own university, their own town, their own situation, came and saw how big, how creative, how strong their community was. Out of this conference, people created magazines, presses, book clubs, radio shows, because in a sense they had the conviction, the power that belonging to a community does. As Catholics, we simply don't have an option. We have the necessity of believing in ourselves as a community. Those who lead the community, those who speak for it, I think have to understand the power of example. You have to embody the values that you want others to pursue. And the power of the word. Having those people there share their ideas, their conversations, their work. I know we're running out of time, so I'll simply end it there, is that I believe that the most important thing that I can do at this point in my career is, in a sense, foster the community that will allow younger Catholics, younger Catholic writers and intellectuals to enlarge this conversation. I am extraordinarily optimistic when I meet literally hundreds of young, faithful Catholic intellectuals and artists who are engaged with this. What they don't have are the institutions, the network, or the opportunities, in a sense, to do their work, not on a private level, but a public level. And any writer who begins to publish, who begins to be reviewed, who begins to be criticized, in a sense, grows better versus isolation. There are a few people, an Emily Dickinson, a Gerard Manley Hopkins, who can exist in isolation, but the rest of us, like it or not, need one another. Thank you.